January 3, 2026, at 2 a.m. Caracas, where Delta Force operators backed by CIA intelligence stormed Nicolas Maduro's compound, and explosions lit up northern Venezuela while American bombers neutralized air defenses and dozens died in the raid. Maduro was photographed aboard the USS Iwo Jima, blindfolded with noise-canceling headphones en route to New York, where he'd face narcoterrorism charges. But among the dead were 32 Cuban soldiers, because Cuba hadn't just supported Venezuela diplomatically, but had effectively controlled its security apparatus with 32,000 Cuban agents embedded throughout Venezuelan intelligence and internal security, and even Maduro's personal protection detail. When Delta Force captured Maduro, they destroyed Cuba's economic model. And here's why. Before this raid, Venezuela supplied Cuba with 46,500 barrels of oil per day, representing subsidized crude at below market prices in a system that kept Cuba powered since Hugo Chavez proclaimed perfect happiness between the two countries in 1999. Cuba sent troops and intelligence and regime protection while Venezuela provided oil, but this partnership ended the moment Maduro was arrested, leaving Cuba with 15 to 20 days of oil reserves, and after that complete darkness permanently. Before we continue though, understanding how economic siege functions as regime change doctrine rather than humanitarian concern diverges sharply from mainstream foreign policy narratives. Real geopolitical analysis requires studying these power projection mechanisms, so subscribe to the channel so you never get caught off guard by financial crises. The Venezuela-Cuba deal wasn't simply an oil agreement, but the economic architecture that allowed Cuba's system to survive after Soviet subsidies ended, and between 1999 and 2013, Chavez supplied up to 100,000 barrels per day, where the oil subsidy was worth $1.5 billion per year. Cuba provided security expertise that kept Chavez, then Maduro, in power against coup attempts and protests and internal threats, where Cuban agents trained Venezuelan intelligence and controlled military loyalty and provided presidential protection, and when Maduro faced his own survival crises, Cuban personnel formed the regime's backbone. But here's what this partnership masked: structural economic deterioration, where, while Venezuelan oil kept the lights on, Cuba's domestic production collapsed. Sugar harvests that historically measured in millions of tons fell to 165,000 tons in 2024 to 2025, and real wages adjusted for inflation dropped 96% since 2015, where agricultural mechanization reversed to oxen that were then stolen to feed starving populations. This dependency created fatal vulnerability, where when an economy relies on its own oil, there's resilience. But when you depend on someone else's oil, like a life support system, you don't diversify your economy, and you don't reform, and you don't build resilience, because you assume the lifeline continues because it always has until January 3rd when someone cut the valve. Mexico was Cuba's second supplier with 17,000 barrels per day, but weeks after the Venezuela operation, these deliveries also stopped under pressure from Trump administration threats to weaponize USMCA renegotiation. The calculation is simple. Cuba loses approximately 63,700 barrels per day, where Cuba needs around 60,000 barrels per day just to maintain basic electricity supply, and there's no margin and no backup plan and only a countdown. Cuba didn't just lose oil, but lost revenue from reselling Venezuelan crude at market prices while paying subsidized rates where this hard currency financed food and medicine imports, and these revenues disappeared along with the military partnership that formed the pillar of Cuba's regional security. The assumption that great power protectors would seamlessly replace Venezuela if problems arose is about to be tested. January 29, 2026. The day before Secretary of State Marco Rubio's Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing on Cuba policy, President Trump signs Executive Order 14,380, where the mechanism works like this. Commerce and State Departments identify countries selling oil to Cuba, and the President sets tariffs on goods from those countries, and if deliveries continue, tariffs increase. But listen to Rubio's Senate testimony January 28th. Where he explicitly acknowledges regime change is the objective, and the 1996 Helms-Burton Act codifies the embargo until Cuba's government changes. Title III, activated by Trump in 2019 after 20 years of dormancy, allows American citizens to sue Cuban entities for assets expropriated after 1959. And the Supreme Court is reviewing cases about Cuban government entities losing sovereign immunity, which opens pathways to seizing Cuban assets globally if regime change occurs. This isn't about human rights, but economic siege as regime change doctrine. Mexico feels immediate pressure where Republican Representatives Carlos Jimenez and Mario Diaz-Balart and Maria Elvira Salazar explicitly threatened to weaponize USMCA renegotiation if Mexico continues selling oil to Cuba, and Trump personally asked President Claudia Sheinbaum to suspend deliveries. Sheinbaum faces an impossible situation where her left-wing orientation demands solidarity with Cuba, but Mexico's economic survival depends on avoiding tariffs that would devastate exports, and her compromise is stopping commercial oil sales under pressure while maintaining humanitarian aid, including food and goods shipped by Mexican Navy. The distinction matters legally, but practically Cuba loses those 17,000 barrels per day, and the international community votes 165-7 against the embargo at UN General Assembly, where international law scholars call secondary sanctions, meaning tariffs imposed on third countries for independent transactions, violations of sovereignty. The United States frames this as accountability for a regime that tortures dissidents and imprisons 650 political prisoners following July 2021 protests. And Washington made oil the choke point, where now the question is who's willing to break the blockade and who just makes promises while satellites track empty tanker routes. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov calls American pressure unacceptable and promises necessary political and material support, where the Russian Foreign Ministry condemns Presidential Decree 14,380 as illegal under the UN Charter. And spokesperson Maria Zakharova presents this as Washington's maximum pressure strategy violating international law. Here's what they actually do. Rosneft loaded 100,000 tons of crude oil onto the Gubkin in January, with expected mid-February arrival at Cuba's Matanzas terminal, and these 100,000 tons represent approximately 20 days of consumption at current rates. This buys time but doesn't solve the crisis, and volumes are declining where Russia shipped 600,000 tons of oil in 2022, and 200,000 in 2023, and 100,000 in 2024. Its resource needs constrained by the Ukraine conflict, and sanctions targeting its shadow fleet and its limited capacity to honor major commitments in the Caribbean explain these shipments, and Moscow maintains the Lord's Intelligence Center demonstrating global reach but refuses to risk direct confrontation with the United States over Cuba. Projecting presence is one thing, while sustaining a besieged economy at scale is another. Here's what this means practically. 26 consecutive hours of blackouts in many regions where the Antonio Guterres thermoelectric plant is offline, causing 200 megawatt loss, and the national energy deficit reaches 75% of peak demand. Victoria Grabenwoga, energy analyst at Kepler, estimates Cuba can operate 15 to 20 days at current consumption. Then, energy costs plummet into crisis, where without electricity, there's no water pumping. Artemisa, province water access, reduced 83%, and Havana 80%. And without refrigeration, food spoils, and no hospital equipment, and no public transport. The peso lost 10% of its value in 3 weeks, in early February, representing an 88% drop since 2020, where informal exchange rate hits 405 pesos per dollar versus 24 pesos official rate. Food prices early 2026. Potatoes, 450 pesos per pound, and onions 380, and beans 500, and meat 1,000, where a modest grocery basket costs 10,300 pesos. Average government employee salary is 6,830 pesos per month, and teachers 5,495, and healthcare workers 6,562. And a Cuban doctor earns 4,500 pesos, approximately $16 at informal rate. Late 2025 saw 38,938 dengue cases and 33 deaths in 1 week, including 21 minors, where hospitals lack diagnostic reagents and antibiotics and basic supplies, and patients are sent home without treatment because there are no medicines. Metalip Company develops production of herbal syrups using oregano and eucalyptus and aloe vera, not because they're effective, but because there's nothing else. A 69-year-old cleaning woman whose 10-minute commute now takes 4 hours round trip represents transport collapse, where costs devour her salary, and a 32-year-old woman for whom survival is the only priority sees no government offering hope. This is what maximum pressure looks like practically where, while Washington and Moscow and Beijing play chess Cubans, count hours of darkness. Scenario 1 brings rapid collapse, where total petroleum exhaustion and complete service breakdown and elite fracturing when Geisa can't feed its own members, triggers military coup or negotiated exit when factions perceive survival in change rather than hardening positions. Scenario 2 brings permanent crisis where international support barely prevents total collapse, but doesn't restore power, and the crisis becomes permanent with 12-hour blackouts and extreme scarcity, where the security apparatus maintains control and the population lacks organization for sustained uprising, creating Special Period 2.0 with indefinite duration. Scenario 3 brings internal fracture, where total petroleum exhaustion and public service collapse and elite unity breaks when Geisa cannot feed its own members, leading to military coup or reformist transition or negotiated exit, depending on whether factions see survival in change or position hardening. Scenario 4 brings external intervention, where naval blockade stops all oil imports or Supreme Court decision undermining IEEPA authority or forces the military option with unknown Russian and Chinese response. And this is unlikely but not impossible if humanitarian catastrophe creates political pressure for rescue operation. Scenario 5 brings unexpected stabilization, where Russia or China dramatically increase support demonstrating multipolarity, or Trump accepts face-saving deal, or Venezuelan transition government restores limited flows, but this requires simultaneous position change from all major actors. 5 scenarios and 1 countdown where 15 to 20 days of oil remains and Cuba confirms what Venezuela proved. Economic models built on external subsidies collapse when the patron disappears. Venezuela had oil infrastructure to reactivate after Maduro, where Cuba has only hope for external rescue, and Russia and China promise solidarity but won't risk direct U.S. confrontation in its sphere of influence, where symbolic shipments buy time but don't change trajectories. A multipolar world order means rhetorical support and limited material aid, not decisive intervention. And the United States demonstrates that economic war can impose regime change without invasion if you control the choke point, and other powers won't break the blockade. February 2026, and Cuba has 15 to 20 days of oil left, where the countdown continues, and the verdict isn't in, but time is running out. Thanks for watching. Here's what I want, knowing from you though. If economic siege through secondary sanctions can achieve regime change without military invasion by leveraging great power, unwillingness to risk direct confrontation in adversary spheres of influence, does this represent a successful evolution of coercive statecraft that other nations will replicate, or does it establish a dangerous precedent that undermines international law and creates humanitarian catastrophes for geopolitical leverage? That distinction determines whether we're witnessing an effective foreign policy tool or a blueprint for suffering that solves nothing. So drop your take in the comments, because I genuinely want hearing whether you think maximum pressure achieves stated objectives or just punishes civilian populations while regimes adapt and survive. This is the kind of story YouTube's algorithm doesn't naturally promote because it's too long and too complex and requires too much context. So if you made it this far, hit like to signal the time invested was worthwhile and subscribe for the follow-up, because this crisis isn't over, and in March, we'll know if Cuba found a solution or if the countdown reached 0, and I'll document it either way.